This week, the topic is, if I can make it go, yeah, the world of relationships. So, the world of relationships is very important because actually, as it stands, most people don't necessarily consider all of the relationships that are going on in their life. And we'll come to why that is very shortly. So, we have all our relationships with the external world. Obviously, that's our job, our business, our family, the bus, the
She
mortgage,
needs
whatever
to
it
go.
is,
She needs to go.
all those things. And that external world is something obviously all of us engage with through our own internal reality. So depending on whether we are happy or sad or melancholic or joyous or depressed or whatever it happens to be because of some particular issue like a toothache or whatever, we are all encountering that external world in different ways, obviously. And then there is the physical body. Each one of us has a physical body, and that physical body is is obviously our vehicle. We live in that physical body as essence or consciousness. Um, or you could say as a psychology, but sometimes people disregard their physical body in various ways. Some people push their physical body too far in certain directions, perhaps. And so, therefore, the physical body is another set of relationships which we need to start considering in our esoteric or spiritual journey. And those two worlds represent what we can call the external space. And then at the same time, as you would expect, oh, my cursor's gone. Logically, we have the internal world. So the internal world is something which I mentioned earlier, many people don't relate to or don't consider that often. But that internal world contains what we would call, from an esoteric point of view, our psychological country. So each one of us within our internal reality has this psychological country, which really we don't know. We don't really uh, consider or comprehend in any way what this psychological country is like. And yet it is something very active within us. Obviously, in that psychological country, there's a load of egos. And we can say, as an in an allegorical way, that in the psychological country within us, there is countries, towns, streets, houses, buildings, some of them filled with egos, some of them filled with captured essence, etc., etc., or imprisoned essence within the egos. And that internal world, that psychological country, is generally unknown to us, an unknown landscape. And yet we react to it or behave because of it during our daily life all the time. We are, therefore, victims of circumstance. We always want to consider, what will other people think of me if I do something like that? What would I say if I did this? What about me? What about me? And that is because we don't understand what is going on in our own unknown psychological country. So those are the three kind of areas that we're going to talk about today in terms of relationships, how we relate to them. So when we say we, obviously we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about the essence, the very core of who we are from a spiritual point of view. Now, if we start thinking about this, we can reflect and say, okay, I've got a physical body, and in that physical body, in itself, it's a vehicle for my inner work. And this just drawing here is supposed to represent the vital body going around the physical body. Remember, the vital body was the etheric body, the one we talked about, the aura. um, of the person, and that's an energetic body which looks after the physical when we go to sleep. If we wake up in the morning and we're not sick, then we'll be rejuvenated, revived because of all the work that the vital body does for us. And it's very closely associated with the physical. So I've drawn both there. And then we have this external world we've just mentioned. If you remember, that was the physical world and then all the relationships to that. We can call that, from an esoteric point of view, our psychological gymnasium. We've used that phrase before, and that is getting at the point that in our external world, all the time, different events, circumstances, issues, preconceptions, ideas, etc., are all entering into us, coming into us, and our psychology, the egos and the essence, are reacting to those impressions or the events that come into us. And so, if we, as students of Gnosis, are carrying out some of the practices we've been talking about over the last few weeks, then the more experiences we live through in a conscious way, then we become uh, an expert, or you could say a gymnast, in dealing with those situations because we're able to use the self-observation or the self-remembrance or the key soul as an example, so that in any particular moment, we are getting stronger and better and more used to using those psychological tools, which is why the masters call it a psychological gymnasium. And then finally, as we mentioned already, we have this internal world. So the internal world, I've drawn it here as in the heart, and we know that in past weeks we've talked about the inner being or the intimate or the inner guru, whatever we want to call it. And to make things straightforward at this stage in terms of psychology, we're going to say that that inner being, our own personal inner being, resides in the heart. And again, we'll come back to this in a bit later on to talk about the way in which that our inner being actually works within us. So let's move on. If we think about the person as the most reduced nucleus of society, what does that mean? Okay. Just as we are part of the masses, okay, the masses are an extension of the individual. Okay, because we can say through one stream of discussion, the microcosm, which is the person, is a concentration, I suppose you could say, of the macrocosm, or round the other way, the macrocosm is an extrapolation of the microcosm. So in straightforward language, which you've probably all heard before, what is above is below, and what is below is above, etc. So, in other words, what is inside us exists on the exterior, and what is outside of us exists in our interior. We have our own universe within. Okay. But we can then go on to say that we know, as students of Gnosis, that we all more or less have the same egos within our psychology. Okay, we talked about this in the fourth lecture. We all more or less have the same egos within us. Okay, and that means that when we are identified in any particular moment, i.e., we are identified with a reaction or a situation in our daily life, an event, the ego is manifesting through us and it is driving our false personality. So in any moment, our personality is a reflection of society. So society as a whole, okay, is a reflection of the way in which we are behaving through our false personality. You can therefore say that we, as individuals, based on what we've just said, are a society. We're a multiplicity, a multitude, and that in itself is a society in the microcosm, which is a reflection of what is in the macrocosm. Um, we also know, as an example, that depending on our vibration, we can share our vib our level of vibration in any moment. You remember the talk we did, light, heat, and sound, and we talked about the two pianos. You play a note on one piano and the other one vibrates at the same note. If we are angry, as an example, we radiate anger energetically with the surrounding societies who are all the other people, because everybody's a microcosm of the macrocosm. Now, we think generally as humans that by changing the government or our relationship with any particular society, for example, a group of friends or a group of sports people or a group of traffic wardens, whatever it is, if we change them, we will change society. However, that is not the case because everything is ego based, as we've just described. If it's ego based and everything radiates out from those egos into society, then the way to change the society is to eliminate the corresponding egos. And in that way, we can improve the society. If, for example, each one of us selects any particular ego we may well have observed, the ego of, I don't know, as an example, um, uh, ironic, bad taste jokes. Say someone got that ego. If they eliminate that ego from inside their psychology, then their life will improve. And at the same time, those people around them will have a better society in which to live. So it's like a radiating force or vibration, I suppose you could say, which is permeating out into society based on our own psychological work. So I hope that bit of deep philosophy made sense, but we're going to carry on because it does all join up in a minute. Okay. So looking at this physical body, the vehicle, the relationship of our three-dimensional physical body with the earth, with society, with our family, with our environment, um, all the social problems that we may encounter, problems with uh, friends, people who aren't our friends. Um, Maybe the bus driver annoyed us today and he's no longer our friend. Or you could say the relationship we have with our physical body directly in terms of health. Okay. These are the aspects which we need to consider in terms of relationships with our three-dimensional physical body. Okay. Some people may worry about their three-dimensional physical body to such an extent that they may wish to carry out surgery or some kind of cosmetic procedure just for fashion. Well, that may be because of an ego. Similarly, when we start talking about egos, we can start talking about this external, I can't read that, psychological gymnasium. Again, the society in which we live, the job, the profession, the politics, the news provide for us this psychological gymnasium. But in getting caught up with, for example, our family, world news, or issues with the price of cheese in Denmark or something, then all we do in those moments is that we forget about our physical body. The psychological gymnasium, therefore, would be that in that moment we wouldn't forget ourselves. We would observe the ego manifesting when we're with the family, when we're at work, when we're late for the bus. Start to study ourselves and the relationships we have with ourselves in this psychological gymnasium. And again, we'll come back to this in a bit. Okay. Now, if we start to consider thinking, breathing, and eating as aspects which influence the formation of society. And again, this brings us back to the microcosm and the macrocosm. If we find ourselves thinking too much, too deeply, or too crazily, or in a stressed out way, then our life, well, we end up with a headache, basically. If we don't breathe properly, then we might get into a situation like this guy, where we're actually not in a comfortable place. Or another example, eating. We're eating whilst we're on the phone and watching a film. What are we actually focusing on in that moment? Where is our essence? Where is our concentration? Is it in the film? Is it on the phone? Or is it in the food? Or is it just simply not there at all? This is the state of the majority of humanity in the Western civilization at the moment. We have a mind that is fractionated, and we don't necessarily think, breathe, and eat in a balanced way because we are doing those three things via the ego. Any particular ego may manifest, causing us to experience any particular event in our life in such a way that we are not balanced, and instead we are egoically, mechanically existing rather than living. So, in terms of the thinking, maybe we should give ourselves time to think. Okay, we can breathe more slowly, even we can breathe more clearly. Okay, the ego, excuse me, the ego uses our identification with our physical body and the external world in general, the psychological gymnasium as we just described it, so that we become identified with these things rather than just breathing or just thinking, being 100% in that moment. So when we eat, we just eat, and then it becomes pleasurable. Then the purpose of eating is to eat. It is not to move on to the next job. I need to eat this quickly because I need to go and wash the car. I need to go and get some money. So therefore, I'm going to stop giving myself enough time to do exercise, and I get out of breath because I didn't warm up. Or maybe in the first example, the guy there with the laptop, um, the boss gives him many, many things to do in a short time. And rather than to do them in an organized way, he just loops out and can't do any of it instead. So the ego uses our identification We think our purpose is the car or the money or the beauty. It could be something to do with anger, but anger leads us to problems with the heart, to gluttony. It could be that we eat a fast food meal, go to McDonald's or whatever. But if we go to McDonald's and we're driving the car at the same time and talking to somebody on the phone and eating our burger, do we actually taste the burger? Do we actually take notice of what we're eating in those moments? Because we're so spread between so many things, we are not in the moment. We are identified and not in control. We become, as we've said many times, the victim of circumstance. Okay. So, what about this relationship with the inner being? The inner being is that part within us, which we've talked about a few times already, and we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, which is the real reality of the higher part within us, you could say. Some schools call it the higher self, the superior part, etc., etc. We just call it the inner being. Okay. And the inner being would prefer it if you were in contact with our inner being rather than being identified. And the inner being is that profound reality of who we are because it relates us, as you can see in the middle of the heart, the yellow smiley face, that's us, the divine spark, which is linked ultimately to our interior God, our inner being, which ultimately again is linked back, if you remember from a few weeks ago, to the absolute. So, what's the relationship between personality and essence in relation to human health? All right. So if you remember, second lecture we did, we talked about this bus. So this bus is a representation of the false person, well, excuse me, of the personality. If the essence is driving the personality, it's all good because we are energetically using the energy in our human machine correctly. And therefore, health will be good, logically. But if that ego gets into the driving seat of the personality, it becomes, by definition, the false personality. If we have an ego who's in control, we might become very bossy. We might become, or someone might be impacting us who's very bossy. Or we might get flustered or impatient in any moment. It could be that false personality, because we don't want to be embarrassed, because we could be late, makes us gulp that food, not actually chew the food correctly. Or maybe we eat it when it's cold, or we leave it a bit and then we have it when it's half warm in a microwave or whatever. In other words, we take shortcuts because of the ego of pride, the ego of vanity, the ego of anger, which then make the consumption of food impact our human health ultimately, or could just give us indigestion. It could be that we don't give ourselves enough rest. Or maybe that we're around the other way, that we're too lazy. All of these things affect our health. So, ideally, we want to be healthy, lovely, jubbly human beings. But to do that, to achieve that, to permanently be in that way, we need to start to consciously live our life rather than mechanically exist in a life. It could be that we are influenced by advertising, and whether it's on social media or in the cinema or wherever it is, on the billboards, And that makes us think that, for example, perhaps we need to change our image or our fashion so that we can succeed. So the ego of vanity makes us behave in a certain way so that we can be like everybody else. So the fashion wants us to be individual, or through the fashion, we want to be individual, but at the same time, we want to be like everybody else. So that's a famous picture from Monty Python. Yes, we're all individuals. Okay. So I hope you can see that, by the way. Uh, let's move on. So, you know this triangle, you've seen it many times now on the course, and this triangle is a representation of the three forces, excuse me, of the three factors of the revolution of the consciousness. And you can see on the left there, it says we need to balance the world of relationships through the application of the three factors. So you can see the world of relationship, or the three different worlds of relationships there: the physical body, the psychological gymnasium in the external world, and the interior world. We can see, therefore, how important it is to look after the three-dimensional physical body and to balance these relationships. Remember the three factors: the mystical death, which is related to the external world. So psychologically, the application of the mystical death will eliminate the egos that are reacting to the impressions that come into our physical body based on the events that are happening in the external world. Similarly, the second factor relates to the birth, related to the three-dimensional physical body. And why is that? Because of energy. And as again, last week we talked a little bit about the energy required to run the human machine, to create the human machine. That energy is very much to do with the second factor, the management of the energies. And then finally, that third factor, sacrifice for humanity, is related to our inner being, because the inner being is that which will enable us to learn and then share our own how did you do that, Emmanuel? That was great. There's some lines on there now. Um, related to our inner being. So you can see that without the inner being, the physical body and the external world are meaningless. If we didn't have an inner being, we couldn't apply all the things we're learning about. If we decide to neglect the physical body or the external world, then how could we progress with our inner being? How could we advance spiritually if we decided to ignore the physical body or the external world or the psychological gymnasium? If we forget our inner being, then logically it means that our physical body and our external world will be controlled by ego. So it means, therefore, we need the external world and the physical body to be able to do the inner work. That's why we are in this dimension, the third dimension. That is why you could say ultimately the great experiment is for God to be able to understand itself. It needs some part of itself to be within the third dimension where we are, so that we can learn and understand and take that information back to our inner being. That is all about the Kabbalah, and we'll be talking about the Kabbalah later in the course. Okay, so if you remember, we have this situation where we have the observer and the observed. Each one of us, as students of Gnosis, looking at the ego manifesting through the inferior centers of the human machine. You remember this from last week. So if we use these exercises, observer on the observed or self-remembrance, then we start to see and understand how these egos behave. And we need to be able to concretely understand them before we can eliminate them. If we eliminate any particular ego, you can see them on the right-hand side. If we eliminate any one of those, then the essence which is trapped within that particular ego will be liberated, will be freed up, and will be able to coalesce with the free essence or consciousness, which is on the left-hand side of the drawing, on the observer in the circle. So that free consciousness, which is active and awake, will grow if we liberate consciousness from any trapped ego in any moment. So let's talk about this a bit more. There is a necessity, therefore, to change what we think, feel, and act so that the change is reflected in society. And this is what we said at the beginning, or near the beginning. If we change ourselves internally, then what is radiating out from us will be different, will be better, in inverted commas. And so the society as a whole will start to be better. So the work we are going to do as students of Gnosis in changing our thoughts and feelings and actions is vital for the creation of an improved society. And obviously, that's internally, the microcosm, and externally, the macrocosm, as we said at the beginning. So, we mentioned, you remember that drawing we showed you the heart, and in the heart there was, we said a yellow dot, which was the being. Well, we know from previous talks again that our inner being comprises two fundamental parts: our Divine Mother and our inner Father. Our inner Father is sometimes shown, you may recognize this drawing. This is by William Blake, a very old drawing, and it is the Ancient of Days. Another name for the inner Father is the Ancient of Days. Can I? Oh, yeah. Okay. So our Divine Mother will help us with the psychological death of the ego, the elimination of the ego, the first factor we talked about just now in the triangle. But our Father, our inner Father, is the one who require or needs us to achieve the psychological death. So the mother is an unfolding of the Father, and the Father wants us to eliminate ego so that we can coalesce that essence, so that the free essence doing the psychological work can grow. But at the same time, our Divine Mother, she is the one who will guide us in that practice of psychological death. And she will also carry out the elimination of the ego. We need to remember that as students of Gnosis, we cannot eliminate the ego. We cannot. But our Divine Mother can. Okay? So today, the next part, if I can press the right button down there. To be able to apply the mystical death or the psychological death, we need, we need to first understand the egos within. So I don't mean all of the egos. I mean just the particular ego we are going to try to eliminate. So we need to understand it. And that word understand is vital. It's not enough to just know that I've got an ego of anger. I need to deeply understand that ego of anger within me. And that requires comprehension. But we cannot go from understanding to comprehension, which we will talk about next week, until we have uh, understood the way in which the ego manifests in our daily life. We need to carry out the practice of retrospection. So the practice of retrospection is what we're going to talk about now. And it's a process, another practice. We'll do it in a minute together, but I've written it down into the talk here so you can see it when it gets uploaded onto the website. You can refer back to it at any time. So obviously, what do? The first thing we sit down. Sit down in a comfortable position with the back straight, where you can sit for 20 minutes without moving at all. Then we need to relax, like we normally do. The process of relaxing the physical body. You can do it section by section or part by part as we do. So all of our attention is in the relaxation itself. The relaxation is obviously with the mind as well as the physical body. Then comes the focus. So we're going to concentrate on the practice. And we are going to review the day we've just had from this moment going backwards. So it's whenever we do the practice, if you do it at 9 in the morning, if you do it 9 in the evening, whenever you do the practice, doesn't matter. You start from the moment you do the practice and you go backwards in reviewing all the things that happened during that day. Why is this? Because it could be that we start to go backwards and then we go into yesterday and we go further back into last week and we go further back into last year, for example. Okay. So the retrospection is open-ended, but backwards because we cannot obviously go forwards because we haven't lived that yet. So the review of the day going backwards is something done consciously. It's not mechanical. Okay. What does this mean? We notice all the moments when we were identified or fascinated through the day going backwards. So, oh yeah, I remember when I was rushing along the road and I dropped my handbag because I was late and I couldn't find the keys. And why was that? Oh, because I had to go and drop off the auntie at the doctor's. And why was that? Oh, because it just goes back and back and back. And you see it from a psychological point of view in the moments when we were identified or fascinated, which for most of us is pretty well all the time. Okay. If we're in the moment, if we're applying the key soul, if we're applying the practice observer and the observed, then we will have moments when we are not identified. But there will always be within our day until we become very advanced times or moments when we are identified or fascinated with any particular ego that is manifesting. And we go back to those moments. And when we do this, we do not relive the ego or the situation or the event. Instead, we do this retrospection without attachment. Okay. So it's like we are in a in a theatre. Imagine we're sat in the audience of a theatre and we see on the stage all these actors coming in and then leaving, going off stage, and they come back in again and they leave stage, etc. They, you could say, are the egos, the situations, and the events where we were identified or fascinated. We are not attaching ourselves to them. We are an audience member. We're in the audience of the theatre, looking, observing those moments. Okay. We are not reliving them. We are not getting caught up with them again. Okay. In the retrospection, we are just reviewing when, how, why, where these moments occurred in our daily life. Okay. So the reason we've done all these practices up to now is to give us the set of tools we need to be carrying out this practice of retrospection without becoming identified with it. We don't need to lose ourselves and get angry all over again because some football team won and some other football team didn't win or whatever. Okay, what we need to do is not get stressed out about the fact that our boss made our lunch break too short, or we need to get completely uh, uh, detached from the stress of living with Auntie Rachel with her blue hair. What we need is to be able to just look at the day, review the day, and in doing so, we will be able to find or see, or through that review, any particular ego that manifests the most. Or maybe it'd be a group of egos that manifest periodically or in a certain rhythm, you could say, through the day. We start to see how the egos are using our daily life to manifest through us. Okay. And then what will come after this is the next stage, which relates to the psychological death, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail next week, the actual practice of the psychological death. But the retrospection is a fundamental part of that. Okay. So we need to be able to sit, relax, focus, and then review going backwards from this moment. Okay, I hope you're all okay with that. I think that's the end. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so what I'll do now is we're going to do a practice. I'm not going to record this one because it's quite fiddly.